Hey guys! Tonight we're heading into the misty back streets of colonial Shanghai, a city that never truly slept. Picture this. Velvet opium dens glowing like lanterns in the fog. The distant clang of rickshaws on wet stone. And a man sitting alone with his first pipe, unaware it might also be his last. This isn't just history. It's a slow descent into a world where addiction was as common as breath, and where entire lives disappeared into smoke. It's haunting. It's intimate, and honestly, you might not survive a single night in his shoes. So, before you get too cozy, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. And as always, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. First pipe. First step into the fog. He didn't enter the opium den with any expectation. In fact, expectation had long since been replaced with something quieter, something like numbness, but deeper, more resolute. He wasn't running, nor was he chasing. He was simply tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind that hollowed you out so slowly you didn't notice the pieces missing until you tried to speak and found there were no words left. The door was barely visible through the misted alley. A thin slice in a wall of brick and rot. A faded curtain hung over the threshold, more symbolic than private. He stepped through it, not with drama, not even hesitation, just inertia. Just gravity, pulling a body that no longer cared much for destination. Inside, time warped. There was no clear lighting, no shadows, just a soft amber haze that made everything seem suspended. Not floating, drifting. The air carried a warmth that felt borrowed, as if the room had once held a fire long ago, and now clung to its ghost. A boy, maybe 15, maybe 50, handed him a pipe with no ceremony. No words, just motion, learned and repeated. The ritual didn't require meaning, only presence. He held the pipe as one might hold something fragile and forgotten, like a letter from someone you no longer remember but cannot throw away. The wood was smooth from years of hands just like his. He noticed the carvings, clouds and waves. Maybe lotus petals, and wondered briefly if they had been meant as art or distraction. When he inhaled, the smoke entered him like memory. It didn't sting. Not really. It wasn't pleasant either. It was quiet. A kind of warmth that wasn't heat, but the illusion of it. Something soft passed through him, like fingers smoothing crumpled pages. He felt his chest expand, not with breath, but with silence, not the absence of sound, but the absence of struggle. Around him, men lay in postures of defeat dressed as sleep, heads tilted, limbs slack, mouths slightly open as if mid-thought, or mid-prayer, or mid-regret. There was no moaning, no conversation, only the occasional shift of fabric, the sigh of wood beneath weight. The den wasn't a place of escape. It was a place of erasure. He didn't know what he expected to feel. What he felt was less, not lighter, just less. Less ache, less alertness, less presence. And that absence felt holy. The second puff came easier, not out of want, but because the motion had already begun, somewhere in his chest. The long-held breath unravelled. He leaned back against the wall, letting its coolness ground him. The world outside the noise, the hunger, the impossibility of tomorrow dimmed like distant thunder. Still there, but irrelevant. He had thought he'd recognise the moment addiction began, that it would arrive like a thief or a lover or a scream. But there was no moment, only this, a gentle slide, too slow to catch, too soft to fear. A comfort laced with quiet harm. He watched a man near him drop the pipe. Fingers limp, mouth slack. No one moved to help. No alarm, no urgency, just the understanding that this was how things went. If he woke, he woke. If not, the pipe would pass to someone else. There was always someone else. And in that moment, he understood something he wouldn't be able to articulate for years. That opium didn't steal your life all at once. It asked for pieces. Small ones. Easy to give. A little sleep here. A little hunger there. The desire to write. The need to speak. The will to stand. It was patient. Courteous. Even. It gave before it took. It soothed before it silenced. Outside, Shanghai pulsed with contradictions, colonial ambition. Neon dreams. Police sirens. And broken promises. But inside this room, time sagged. He could no longer tell if it was night or day, June or December. He didn't care. Somewhere far away. He had a name, a face, perhaps a sister who still whispered it, a mother who refused to stop waiting. But those things felt like fiction now. And this room, this pipe, this fog, they were real in a way nothing else was. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to drift, to sink into the space between memory and forgetting. The fog didn't claim him. He offered himself, and it received him gently, like it had done for so many before. He wasn't sure how long he stayed. The concept of time, once so rigid, began to bend. Minutes swelled into hours, or collapsed into seconds. He could no longer tell. The mind, when unanchored, floats, and float he did through memory and dream and silence, until even the difference between them blurred. He saw flashes not of light, but of before, a tin bowl he used to eat from, the face of someone who used to smile when he walked in, the smell of river mud on laundry day. These weren't full memories, not even clear images, just the ghost of a feeling, like hearing a song from the next room and knowing it once meant something, but not remembering the lyrics. And beneath it all, a low hum, not in the room, but in his chest, a vibration that felt like dread, but quieter, a reminder that something, somewhere inside him, still noticed, still resisted. It wasn't loud, but it was there. The man next to him shifted, muttered something in a dialect he didn't recognize, then fell still again. He looked young, but his skin had the parchment texture of someone older. Or maybe that's what addiction did, it rewrote the calendar of the body. Across the room, a woman sat upright, hair pinned back with the precision of a ritual. Her eyes were open, but not seeing. Her hand held the pipe delicately, like a performer might hold a fan. She didn't move. She didn't need to. Stillness had become her role, her profession, maybe even her armor. He wondered. Then, if everyone here had once believed they'd only try it once, if they, like him, had told themselves they were too strong to fall, that it was just to take the edge off, just to sleep, just this week. He thought about the word just, how small it seemed, how deadly. He exhaled again. The smoke, now familiar, curled upward before dissolving into nothing. He watched it rise and disappear. That, he realized, was what he wanted. Not to die, but to unexist. To lift up from this life and dissolve, quietly, with no pain, no sound, no explanation. There was no pain in this room. That was the allure. Not joy, not ecstasy, just the absence of pain. In a city built on noise and greed and power, this room was a pocket of mercy. Or maybe that was the lie. Maybe this room was the softest trap ever designed. Not by cruelty, but by necessity. When life becomes unbearable, even numbness feels like salvation. A small bell rang near the door. Someone was leaving. Someone else entering. The cycle continued. Bodies shifted. Pipes were wiped and passed. The ritual went on. Time didn't. He looked down at his hands. They were still his, but they felt like they belonged to someone already halfway gone. The creases, the dirt under the nails, the calluses, they all told a story he was beginning to forget. What had he done before this? Who had he been? A craftsman, a teacher, a thief. He couldn't recall. The fog thickened around his thoughts. The pipe, now cooled, rested in his lap. He didn't move to fill it again. Not yet. He wasn't chasing a high. He was waiting for the silence to return. Because in that silence, there was no fear, no memory, no need. Just being, just less. And somehow, that felt like a kindness. No name, just Ash. He was still called by his name. At first. A few of them remembered it the boy who ran errands for the owner. A woman who always sat near the corner and smoked in half-breaths. They used it like a placeholder. Not out of care, but because they hadn't yet forgotten who he used to be. But names, like paper soaked in rain, don't last long here. Within weeks, the name was replaced with a gesture, a glance, a nod toward the space he usually claimed. Him, they'd say, if they said anything at all. Eventually, even that disappeared. The room no longer required him to be anyone. He was a presence, a silhouette in the fog, a vessel through which smoke passed. He didn't mind. In fact, he welcomed it. The shedding of identity felt like freedom. He was no longer the son who hadn't written in months. No longer the brother who stopped showing up. No longer the boy who once knew how to laugh without calculation. He had become Ashlight. Grey, silent, drifting. There was no event, no moment of clear transition, just erosion. His memories stopped arriving in sentences. They returned as smells, flashes of sound, fragments of colours, his mother's voice shouting through laundry steam, the metal clang of his father's bowl on concrete, a kite string burning into his palm. But none of these were anchored. They floated, untethered, in the same fog that now lived inside his lungs. Once, someone tapped him on the shoulder in the street and called his name. He turned instinctively, but there was nothing behind his eyes. The sound didn't fit anymore. He blinked, smiled politely, and walked away. It wasn't that he didn't recognize the person. It was that he no longer felt entitled to be recognized. There's a kind of forgetting that feels like a kindness. Then there's the other kind, the kind that leaves you rootless, voiceless, empty of even the desire to be known. That's what he had become. Not invisible, just irrelevant. He stopped looking into mirrors. They only reflected contradiction. His face remained, but the story beneath it had faded. Like ink on old cloth, he wasn't aging. Not in the usual way. He was thinning less substance, less presence. His hands still moved. His breath still came. But he no longer felt like a person moving through the world. He felt like smoke borrowing a body. People in the den stopped using his name, not out of cruelty, but because there was no need. He was dependable in his disappearance. A ghost who hadn't yet died. A placeholder for all the things they feared they might become. And so they left him in peace. Ash doesn't demand. It settles. It waits. It doesn't ask to be remembered. He didn't expect a funeral. He didn't expect anyone to light incense or whisper his name. He only hoped that when he finally drifted away for good, the fog might carry him softly, as it had done every night since that first pipe, that someone, even if only the wind, might pause and say not his name, but simply, he was here, once. The den no longer needed him to speak. In fact, silence had become his most fluent language. Words felt heavy, unnecessary. Communication dissolved into glances, the tilt of a head, the brief pass of a pipe between fingers. No one asked questions. No one offered answers. What was there left to say? He began to forget the seasons. The city outside carried on carts rattled over stones. Bells rang from temples. Rain fell in sheets against rusted tin, but these things were distant, like the sounds of another life bleeding through paper walls. Inside the den, there was only warm dusk and the drifting glow of coals, as if time had given up its schedule and now simply hovered. At some point, even his habits faded. He stopped measuring his days by the number of smokes or the weight of coin in his pocket. He no longer noticed who came or went. Even the boy who used to hand him the pipe, he couldn't say when that boy had vanished. Replaced by someone else. Or had it been the same boy? Just older. The fog made everything blur. Even age. Sometimes he would see his own hand reach for the pipe and marvel at how detached it felt, like watching a stranger mimic his life. The skin had grown sallow, nails rimmed with soot. His fingers trembled now, not from need, but from forgetting how to hold still. He imagined them as charred branches, still upright but hollow inside. There were nights he thought they were nights, though it was hard to be sure when the smoke wouldn't take him completely. When dreams flickered, half-formed and disturbing. In those fragments, he saw a table, a hand reaching across it, the sound of a baby crying, a sudden, irrational memory of pears, overripe and bleeding juice into his palms. But the images vanished before he could trace their source. They left him with a feeling that hovered somewhere between guilt and grief, though he couldn't recall why. He learned to let them pass. Names began to disturb him. Once, a new man in the den muttered his own name aloud, perhaps trying to reassure himself of his presence. That single word cut through the fog like a blade. It felt arrogant, loud. He turned away, not from annoyance, but from shame for the man, for himself, for all those who still believed names could protect them. Because names imply identity. Identity implies continuity. And in this place, continuity was the first thing to go. You weren't who you were yesterday. You weren't anyone at all. You were what the smoke made you, and only for as long as it allowed. Occasionally, he'd walk the streets in the early hours, when Shanghai was still wiping the sweat of night from its forehead. People rushed past him without notice. Vendors yelled into the morning with voices he once understood. Now they rang like birdsong, familiar but incomprehensible. He drifted among them like mist, a man-shaped absence. There was a tea stall on Nanking Road that he used to pass often. The owner had once smiled at him, even remembered how he took it no sugar, always hot. That had stopped months ago. Now the owner didn't even glance up, and that, somehow, felt right. Recognition would have been an intrusion. A lie? He understood. Now, what it meant to disappear while still breathing. To become the ash left behind when someone else's story ends. Ash doesn't rot. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't scream. It just settles. And that, he thought, was maybe the kindest thing he could become. The British man with silver. He came on Thursdays. Always Thursdays. The hour varied sometimes in the gold light of late afternoon. Sometimes well after dusk had swallowed the street, but the rhythm never changed. Once a week. Without fail. A man in a grey suit. Creased to perfection. With polished shoes that seemed immune to the filth of Shanghai's alleys. His skin pale, as if he carried no blood. Only contract and calculation. They called him the Englishman, though no one ever asked for his name. Names were unnecessary. His presence was his introduction, and his silver was the language everyone understood. He never sat, never smoked, never touched the pipe. He stood near the entrance, gloved hands clasped behind his back, watching not the people, but the system. He was not a voyeur. He was an auditor, a man ensuring that the engine he had helped design continued to hum as expected. Each week, he would pass silver to the proprietor, clean coins that shone like mirrors in the den's dim haze, and in return, nothing changed. The pipes remained full, the men remained quiet, the fog remained thick. That was the transaction: silver for silence, silver for slow death. He was always alone, yet never without power. He didn't threaten. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to part the smoke. The air tightened when he entered. Not out of fear, but recognition, like a well-trained dog responding to the scent of its master. To the others, he was just a figure. But to the man we follow, he became something more. A reminder of what? Exactly, he could not say. Maybe of everything he'd once tried to escape. Maybe of the world that ran parallel to this one, the world of sharp suits. Called logic, unblinking cruelty. Because this man didn't need the pipe. He was the reason the pipe existed. The Englishman's silver wasn't payment. It was investment. Each coin was a seed planted in poisoned soil. And the addicts were the crop silent. Bent. Predictable. There was profit in dependency. Efficiency in despair. One day, he dared to meet the Englishman's eyes. Just once. What he saw wasn't cruelty. It was detachment. The kind of gaze that measures weight and yield. Not pain. A look that didn't see a man, but a system functioning as it should. He realized then that suffering, to people like this, was not tragic. It was a byproduct. An accepted cost. Like dust in a ledger. He wanted to speak, to ask why, to accuse, to beg, but no words came. What would he say? That this was wrong, that he deserved better, that he had once dreamed of something more. The Englishman would not have answered, and even if he did, the answer would have been simple, brutal, and true. You chose this, because that was the brilliance of the system. It didn't force, it offered. It allowed men to walk into their own cages. It provided the key and let you turn it, and when the door clicked shut, it told you, you are free. This was your choice. So he looked away. The Englishman never missed a Thursday, rain or riot, festival or famine. He came with silver, with silence, with the certainty that this place would still be here, that these men, these ghosts would still be waiting, curled in their corners, breathing smoke and forgetting themselves. And they were. Each week, one or two fewer, sometimes replaced, sometimes not. But the fog never thinned. The pipes never ran dry. He began to wonder what the silver was really buying. Was it the opium itself? The quiet compliance of the addicts? Or something deeper, an entire city's willingness to turn its face away? He no longer hated the Englishman. Hatred required fire, and he had long since gone cold. What he felt was more dangerous. Understanding. The kind of understanding that numbs the tongue and hollows the spine. The kind that says, this is how things work. Always have. Always will. Once, in another life, he might have written about it, exposed it, named names. Now, he simply inhaled. Let the fog come. Let the system profit. Let the silver pass hand to hand, week after week, until there was no one left to remember what had been traded or lost. Not even himself. He began to count Thursdays not by the calendar, but by the weight in the room. The Thursdays when the British man came felt colder. Somehow, not in temperature, but in presence. Like the fog itself hesitated, unsure whether it should wrap around someone who walked through it untouched. The man never shivered, never blinked, never adjusted his cufflinks. He arrived with the stillness of a ticking clock and left with the certainty of a page already turned. And the silver always the same. 2 coins, placed precisely on the lacquered table. Not tossed, not handed, placed, like ritual offerings. The proprietor never thanked him, merely nodded and tucked them away, as if they had been expected all along. There was something sacramental about the exchange, a liturgy of corruption, and each week, as the coins disappeared into drawers and the smoke rose into tired lungs, the city above carried on, unaware or uncaring, or maybe both. Once, after a long silence, one of the older men in the corner muttered, "They call it silver, but it's the colour of forgetting." His voice cracked. More air than tone. No one replied. The British man had already left. What struck him most wasn't the transaction itself, it was its ease. How simple it was to buy ruin. How cheap. How quiet. The coins never clinked. The door never slammed. If the devil had arrived with horns and fire, perhaps someone would have fought back. But dressed in grey, with silver in his hand, the devil passed unnoticed. And slowly, this understanding grew inside him not like a flame, but like rot. Quiet. Persistent. Irreversible. He started watching the others more closely. Their bodies. Their breath. How their chests moved. How some moved less each week. How some stopped moving entirely. And when they did, there was no scream. No rush. Just the quiet shuffle of cloth. The pipe passed to someone else, and the silver continuing its weekly pilgrimage. Sometimes, he wondered if the Englishmen even knew their names. Likely not. Likely didn't care. But it wasn't personal. That was the worst of it. It was never personal. Just systemic. Efficient. Like steam rising from a machine, hissing softly while it devoured whatever was fed into it. Colonialism had not died. It had simply learned to whisper. And in that whisper was profit. Measured not just in silver, but in silence, in how little resistance came, in how many lives could be erased without notice. He remembered, vaguely, A lesson from when he was young, something about opium wars, gunboats, treaties. Back then, it had sounded like history. Now it sounded like a ledger. He realised, with a cold clarity, that history was never about what happened. It was about who profited from what was allowed to happen again and again. And as long as the silver kept flowing, the smoke would never run out. He stopped wondering when his Thursday would come when he, too, would fail to rise. His breath claimed in the same quiet efficiency. It no longer mattered. The only thing left was to bear witness not through action, not through resistance, but through stillness, through the slow collapse of a man who knew the system's name but not his own anymore. The Englishman came, week after week, and he watched, and he inhaled, and the room remained. When dreams were measured in grams, it began as a transaction, 1 gram for 1 night of quiet, a fair exchange, or so it seemed at first. The math was simple, almost elegant. A few coins for peace, a few hours where the body stopped screaming, where the past stopped knocking, where sleep came without argument. But peace, like hunger, grows, and dreams, those fragments of what life once promised, require more to sustain them than smoke alone. He learned the weights quickly, not because he cared for precision, but because his life began to orbit around numbers he used to ignore. 1 gram gave him 4 hours. If he didn't move, 2 grams bought 6, maybe 7, if the pipe was hot and the room still. Beyond that, it blurred. He stopped trying to count. Instead, he measured his days in loss. The coins were the first to go. He sold a pair of shoes next. Leather. Once polished to a sheen he could no longer imagine caring about. Then the coat thick wool, lined with silk at the cuffs. A gift, he vaguely recalled, from someone with kind eyes. He couldn't remember who. Each item shed felt like shedding skin. At first, it stung, but soon, it felt natural, liberating. Even, what need had he for shoes, when his feet no longer carried him anywhere worth going? What use was a coat, when warmth could be smoked into the lungs? He began to trade blood, not openly, not in alleys with knives, but with a quiet man near the docks, who asked no questions. A needle, a bottle, a few moments of dizziness, and then silver, enough for a night, sometimes 2. The world spun after, but the pipe steadied him, smoke as ballast. He told himself it was temporary, but deep down, even that voice had started to fade. The voice that once spoke of enough, and of escape, of return. It whispered now, weak and unsure, from some collapsed chamber of memory. The grams defined everything. Food was measured in how much it cost relative to the next hit. Conversations became barters. Time became a waiting room between highs. The body, once his, became a vessel he rented by the gram breaking apart slowly between each use. And sleep. Sleep was the cruelest trick. When it came, it was shallow, scattered with phantoms, shapes at the edges of dream, faces that smiled too long, hands reaching but never touching. He woke each time unsure if he'd actually slept or just drifted behind his own eyes. Yet he still chased it, still believed the next pipe might bring that one perfect hour, the hour without pain, without memory, without fear. He thought of dreams often, not the hopeful kind, not ambition, but the literal ones, the kind children are granted as birthright untouched by weight or consequence. He remembered, faintly, a dream of flying, of open sky and wind without direction. He hadn't had it in years. Now, even in sleep, he was grounded, anchored by the weight of the very grams he used to escape. One night, he offered his belt to the den master. Thick leather, brass buckle. It had once held up trousers tailored for a man with pride. Now, it hung useless. The den master accepted it without question. He smoked that night with a strange ache not in his chest, but somewhere quieter, somewhere deeper. He couldn't name it. Regret, maybe, or recognition, that even the belt had meant something. Once, he began to notice others trading too. A man gave up his wedding ring. Another, A photograph. A woman offered her hair. Each item fed the fire. Each memory melted into smoke. The room became a museum of surrender, curated by hunger. And through it all, the British man kept coming. The silver flowed. The grams flowed. And these ghosts in progress floated with it, weightless and wanting, measuring their worth not in years, not in stories, but in grams. The exchanges became easier, not just physically, but morally. What once might have felt like a line crossed now felt more like a formality. He gave what he had, and the pipe gave what it could, but the balance never held. He sold the buttons off his last shirt one by one, not because they were valuable, but because everything else was gone. The tailor had stitched them by hand, pearl-like discs that had once gleamed beneath a vest. Now, they bought him half a night, maybe less. What surprised him wasn't how quickly things disappeared, but how little he missed them. Memory itself had become a burden. He didn't want to remember where the buttons came from, or who had admired them, or what kind of man he had once tried to be. Those thoughts pulled at him like anchors, and he had no more strength for resistance. The pipe. The smoke had offered something easier. Erasure. A man across the room collapsed once. Mid-inhale. His body shuddered, then stopped. No one screamed. No one rushed forward. One of the regulars simply pulled the pipe from his hand and passed it on. Later, the body was gone, not buried, not mourned, just gone. It struck him not as a tragedy, but as a warning, not of death, but of how quietly it could arrive, like a whisper in fog, like a debt being collected. He wondered what would be left of him when his time came. Would anyone bother to remove his body? Would they remember where he usually lay? Or would the space be claimed by someone new within the hour? The way a pillow still holds heat from a stranger's sleep. He once tried to barter a book, a small volume of poetry, worn and annotated. The proprietor stared at it for a long moment, then refused. "Words don't burn," he said. "They linger." The man took the book back, but never opened it again. Even the poems had grown too heavy to carry. He began to feel translucent, not in body, but in presence. He could still touch things' walls. Coins. The bowl of rice he sometimes forced down, but he no longer felt as though he impacted them. He moved through the world like breath on glass, visible for a moment, then gone. And through it all, the math continued. How many grams today? How many tomorrow? What remains to be sold? What part of the self can be carved away next? There were no answers, only silence. And in that silence, smoke. Always smoke. Nightmares in velvet boxes. It was called the Magnolia Room, not a den. Not a slum. A place with a name soft enough to promise discretion, elegant enough to mask decay. From the outside, it could have passed for a tea house, or the private quarters of a silk merchant. Carved wood lattice windows, a brass bell that chimed like laughter, lanterns shaded in crimson silk. Inside, everything was velvet. Velvet on the walls, velvet on the cushions, velvet on the silence. The kind of thick, luxurious quiet that wraps itself around your throat and convinces you it's a comfort. The scent of opium was carefully balanced with jasmine oil, as though the rot needed perfume to be palatable. The pipes were silver. The attendants wore embroidered slippers and spoke in voices no louder than rain on paper. This was not the smokehouse he had come from. This was a theatre, a dream stage, where decay wore rouge and addiction came draped in robes. He didn't belong here, but someone had brought him. A stranger, clean-faced, dressed in tailored linen, who called him friend though they'd never met. "You need to see it," he said. "You need to know what the rich dream about when they rot." And so he went. The Magnolia Room did not refuse guests. It absorbed them. Here, the addicts didn't collapse on mats. They reclined on daybeds with carved feet, beneath canopies threaded with gold. There were no moans, no coughing fits, only the occasional exhale, slow and refined, like a sigh escaping from the throat of the world. But he saw it beneath the velvet. The same ghosts. Their clothes cleaner, their rings intact, their perfumes more exotic. but the eyes were identical, glazed not by wealth, but by the same hunger he carried like a wound. The same erasure! He sat. An attendant lit the pipe for him. The smoke tasted different, richer, smoother, like it had been aged in cedar, but it did the same work. It numbed, it quieted, it erased, and that's when he understood. The beauty here wasn't comfort. It was camouflage. Addiction in the alley was honest. It showed its sores, its trembling hands, its hunger. But here, in this velvet-lined tomb, the addiction wore perfume and spoke French. It didn't scream, it smiled. And in that smile was a lie so well practiced. Even the dying believed it. The Magnolia Room was a paradox where one could die with dignity, but without witness, because everything here was designed to distract. The curtains, the music, the gentle clink of porcelain cups. You didn't feel yourself decaying. You felt yourself dissolving, gracefully. He watched a man, perhaps a magistrate, perhaps a banker, lift a pipe with fingers that shook beneath jade rings. His robe was silk, but stained at the hem. His posture was elegant, but his teeth were gone. He whispered something to no one, then smiled. And for a moment, he looked almost beautiful. Almost. There was no hierarchy in death, but there was in dying. In the alley den, the fall was fast and rough. Here, it was slow, almost reverent, like a descent rehearsed for an audience that would never arrive. The attendants never looked directly at the guests. Their eyes slid past, polite and empty. They refilled pipes. They adjusted pillows. They spoke as though the people before them weren't fading, just dreaming. And in a way, they were. He left the Magnolia Room after hours. He wasn't sure how many. The lanterns outside were still burning, and the sky had begun its slow shift into dawn. He didn't speak to the man who had brought him. Didn't thank him. There was nothing to thank. That night, back in his own den, he refused the pipe. Not from strength, but from nausea. Because now, when he closed his eyes, he didn't see fog or silver or even the British man. He saw velvet, and it terrified him more than anything else. He returned again, days later, not out of desire but out of compulsion. The Magnolia Room lingered in his thoughts like a taste left too long on the tongue. The memory of it was soft, but insidious. He needed to know if what he had seen was real, or merely a hallucination dressed in silk. It was real. The velvet had not faded. The curtains still rippled gently in the draughtless air. A woman played the zither, her fingers gliding across strings like water on glass. The music was low, sweet, and utterly forgettable, perfectly designed to soothe without distracting. He took a different seat this time, further from the centre. He didn't smoke immediately. Instead, he watched how people here didn't call it addiction. They called it relaxation, meditation, an escape from noise. They quoted poetry while their veins darkened. They murmured Confucius between long inhales. They wore their decay with grace, and expected it to be respected. The lie here wasn't just in the decor, it was in the language. No one here was an addict. They were connoisseurs of the fog. They were patrons of private restoration. They exchanged dosages the way sommeliers exchange notes on wine. But beneath the robes, they were gaunt. Their hands trembled when they thought no one was watching. The fog clung to their faces the same way it did in the alley den, and when they thought themselves alone, the desperation returned in the way they clawed at their pipes, in the way their eyes begged for one more hit. The difference was, here, desperation was dressed in ritual. He saw a young woman whose cheekbones were too sharp for her age. Her robe was embroidered with birds, and her lips painted a shade too red. She laughed as she inhaled, tilting her head back with practiced elegance. But when she exhaled, her expression collapsed. For a second, just a second, he saw the fear behind her eyes, and then it was gone, hidden beneath another laugh. It reminded him of funerals, the way people arrange flowers over a body and speak softly, as if the dead might be soothed by gentleness. That was what the Magnolia Room was, a funeral without the honesty of a coffin. When he finally took the pipe, it felt colder, Not in temperature, but in intention. It was too perfect, too clean. The smoke entered his lungs with precision, but no warmth. He felt himself lift, but not with relief. It was like being embalmed while still breathing. He didn't stay long. Outside, the alley stank of fish and sewage. A man vomited against a wall. A child cried for coins. And for the first time, he felt something like gratitude for the ugliness of it all. Because out here, at least the dying was honest. Inside the velvet box, you didn't just lose yourself. You learned to smile while doing it. And that, he realized, was the most terrifying dream of all. The children watching from the alley. They sat where the lamplight ended, on the low stone ledge beside the gutter, their legs swinging in silence. Sometimes 5, sometimes 7, sometimes just one alone. Dirt on their cheeks, knees scraped raw, shirts too big or too thin for the weather. They didn't speak much, not because they had nothing to say, but because they already knew everything that words could offer. And it wasn't enough. They weren't allowed inside the den. That space belonged to the grown men and women who had lost their names, lost their jobs, lost their children. But the smoke escaped anyway, curling through cracks and drifting down the alley like a lazy ghost. The children breathed it without meaning to. It sat on their shoulders. It crept into their clothes. They didn't play, not really. They watched. They watched adults stumble out, eyes unfocused, feet unsure. Watched them lean against walls and slide down. Watched them vomit into drains. Watched them forget where they were supposed to go. One of them barefoot, with a copper bracelet on his ankle used to count the bodies. Not the dead, but the ones who couldn't stand. He called it the sleep tally. Sometimes he whispered the numbers. Sometimes he drew them in chalk on the brick. But the rain always came and washed them away. Like the city itself didn't want to keep score. There was a girl, maybe 10, who sat every day with her back to the wall, a rag doll in her lap. The doll had no arms. She never looked directly at the den, only at the people coming out. Her eyes followed each one as if she were waiting. Maybe for her father, maybe for her mother, or maybe just for the moment when someone might come out looking different better. No one ever did. He noticed them slowly, over time. At first, they were just background, the street's texture. But one afternoon, as he stumbled out of the den, he felt their eyes on him, not judging, not afraid, just waiting. That look haunted him. Not because it was angry, but because it was resigned. These children weren't shocked. They weren't learning about addiction. They were inheriting it. He tried once to speak to one of them. A boy, maybe 7, crouched beside a broken lantern. He asked his name. The boy didn't answer, just stared at the pipe in his hand, then looked away. That was all, but it said everything. The boy knew the weight of that pipe, knew its cost, even if he didn't yet know the word for despair. Another time, he overheard 2 of them talking, not in anger, but logistics. If Ma doesn't wake up, we can go to Auntie. She won't take both of us. Then I'll tell her you died. Okay. No tears, no drama, just the soft negotiations of a childhood buried under survival. And the city let it happen. The same way it let the silver flow. The same way it let the fog rise. Because the cost of addiction is never contained to a single body. It spills. It echoes. It teaches. These children weren't watching by choice. They were waiting. For change. For rescue. For some version of a future that didn't smell like soot and sickness. He wondered what they'd become. Would they follow their parents? Would they learn to numb the same pain with the same poisons? Or would they harden into something else entirely? Something colder. Something that mistook numbness for strength. He wanted to believe they'd survive. But belief felt fragile these days. Like something that burned too quickly and left no warmth behind. One night, stumbling past them, he dropped a coin. A real one. Enough for bread. The smallest child picked it up, turned it over in her palm, and placed it back beside him without a word. She knew what silver bought in that alley, and it wasn't bread. One evening, a small boy stood up from the stone ledge and walked toward the entrance of the den. no older than 6. His feet were bare, soles black with street dust, one eye swollen from some long-forgotten scrape. He didn't look around, didn't speak, just walked straight toward the doorway, as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. The attendant stopped him gently. A hand on the shoulder, a shake of the head. The boy didn't argue. He just waited. Waited while a man stumbled out, clothes torn, lips dry, eyes clouded and collapsed inches from where the boy stood. The man groaned once, then went silent. The boy didn't move. He watched, as if trying to understand how far someone had to fall before they disappeared completely. Behind him, the others remained seated, watching, learning, absorbing everything without words. And he saw it. Then the true danger wasn't the pipe. It wasn't even the fog. It was the ritual of it. The normalization. How suffering became scenery. How watching became habit. These children weren't horrified because they'd never known a world without this. Their stories began in smoke. Their lullabies were groans. Their first lessons came not from books, but from the bodies of their parents. He remembered a girl once, maybe 12, who came every Thursday with her little brother. She sat on the opposite side of the street, her back straight, eyes alert. She watched the men come and go, but she never cried. One day, the boy asked her something too soft to hear, and she replied, "When he stops walking. We go to the river." He never saw them again. Maybe they left. Maybe they drowned. Or maybe they just blended into the street the way everything else did, slowly erased by the city's indifference. He began to understand addiction was never solitary. Even in silence, it echoed. Even in stillness, it touched everyone nearby. And these children, they were the next echo. Not yet coughing, not yet curled beside a pipe, but already marked. The city didn't care, but he did. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, he felt something stir inside a flicker, small and sharp, like a coal pressed to cold skin. Not guilt, not yet, but something close to memory. He had once been a child, and someone had once watched him from a doorway, hoping he would choose differently. Emily Hahn's hypnosis. She was nothing like him. Emily Hahn was American, educated, curious, a writer, not a drifter. But one afternoon in the mid-1930s, she too sat in a room filled with opium smoke in the heart of Shanghai. This wasn't the Magnolia Room with its finery, nor the alley den with its rot. It was something in between a private salon, seemingly respectable, where colonial privilege met oriental vice. It seemed, then, to promise discretion, even safety. But opium is a democratizer of despair. Emily wrote letters home about the city's sophistication, its jazz clubs, its cafes, its expatriate life. But in those letters, one phrase haunted her later. "I will never leave, I will never come back." At first, she meant the city. But soon, she realized she meant the smoke. She was no longer the observer. She was entangled, a victim of the quiet seduction she'd come to study. She tried to stop. She tried logic. She tried resolve. The British man with his silver was nothing next to how easily desire burrowed under her skin. Yet at some point, everything stopped working. Willpower, shame, memory, they all failed her. She kept puffing, kept promising herself one last time. But one only ever leads to the next. She tried to write. The page stayed blank. Words escaped her as smoke did, curling into nothingness. She tried to walk away. The world outside blurred. The city became a smear. She was no longer a subject. She was the substance. Then she discovered hypnosis. A Westerner. Ironically claimed he could help. He wasn't a doctor, but he had his certifications. His office lined with machines and odd instruments. His approach was clinical, distant, not spiritual, not judgmental. He worked in the language of suggestion and repetition. He told her to breathe deeply. He told her the pipe had no power over her. He told her the smoke would leave her body like water off stone. At first, it felt absurd. Suggestion felt like coins slipped through a hand already numb. But she committed. Because what else could she do? She returned to his office once a week, reclined in a chair under a thin blanket. The lamp soft. The air still. He counted down. She drifted. And in those sessions, something shifted. Not instantly, but slowly, almost imperceptibly. She wrote about it, how the smoke still called to her, but no longer ruled her. She described her dreams returning not just escapes, but actual visions. She dreamt of the Mississippi River, of cotton fields, of confidence rising in her chest. And she remembered words, clear sentences, precise thoughts. It takes more than one session. She knew that. She relapsed. Of course she did. She was human. But with each hypnosis session, the relapses grew less devastating. The grams lost their control. The pipe lost its promise. She didn't become a saint. She didn't become a cautionary tale. She became something rarer. Someone who survived. Someone who carried her scars without surrendering her identity. Someone who understood how softly the fog could claim you and how deliberately she would refuse it again. Her story matters because it's not just about one person. It's about choice and chance, about the difference between collapse and survival, about how addiction can silence a life. But hypnosis or any form of real support can help you reclaim your own voice. In a city built for drowning, she learned to float. She left Shanghai. She wrote. She talked about it. She didn't apologize. She didn't preach. She simply existed, and that was enough to break the pattern. To prove that someone could sit in the velvet room and still remember who they were. Because survival isn't fireworks. It's faint dawn light after a long night. It's breathing deeply when you thought you couldn't. It's telling the story so others know they're not alone. What truly made Emily different wasn't just that she survived, it was that she refused to let the survival become silence. Most who escaped the smoke did so quietly, choosing to disappear into other cities, other lives, as if the past might forget them if they forgot it first. But she wrote. She told the truth, not the grand. Tragic version history likes to frame, but the personal, fractured one, the version that smells like burnt silk and sounds like whispers behind closed doors, she didn't glamorize it. She described the lethargy, the cravings, the isolation of knowing your body no longer obeys your will. She spoke of the nights where even the stars seemed to recoil from her window, and she admitted the hardest part wasn't the quitting but the remembering, the moments when the smoke seemed easier than clarity, when numbness felt kinder than hope, but she stayed with it. Her hypnosis wasn't magic. It wasn't a miracle cure wrapped in suggestion. It was work. Tedious. Incremental. Often invisible. She learned that recovery wasn't about returning to who she was before. It was about becoming someone who could carry the weight without collapsing. In time, she resumed writing fully. Her style changed slower, more deliberate. There was humour, but it was edged with ache. There was light, but always cast through shadow. Her sentences stretched like fingers reaching across water, never quite certain what they'd find. And through it all, she resisted erasure. Because survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about reclaiming authorship of your own narrative. In a city like Shanghai, where thousands disappeared behind smoke-stained curtains, Emily's story stood out not because it was louder, but because it refused to be quieted. She lived long after the fog. She travelled, she loved, she aged, and she carried the memory of the pipe not as shame, but as caution, as a reminder that even the brightest minds, the most articulate tongues, the fiercest spirits are still human, still porous, still at risk, but also still redeemable. Emily never declared herself cured. She never declared herself healed. What she did was continue sentence by sentence, breath by breath, and in doing so, she offered a roadmap not just out of addiction, but back toward meaning in the end. Her legacy isn't in her recovery alone. It's in the fact that she gave others permission to speak, to admit, to seek help, to believe that even in a place built to consume, a life could still be reclaimed, not perfectly, but honestly. And maybe that's what mattered most. Not escape, but return. 10 silver coins for one last breath. His pockets were nearly empty. Not just of money, but of memory, meaning, and marrow. There were 10 silver coins left. Not the clean, pressed kind found in a banker's palm, but tarnished ones edges smoothed by desperation, passed from hand to trembling hand, warm from too many clutching fingers. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His bones pressed against his skin like bars in a cage. His cough had turned sharp. Spitting blood into the corner of a kerchief he no longer bothered to hide. Each breath came with a weight now, a tiny fracture. But the hunger that ruled him wasn't for food. It was for fog. He told himself it would be the last time. Not out of drama, but because there was nothing left to sell. He had pawned his shoes, then his belt, then the last photograph of his family, a curled-edge image of a boy and a woman, long faded. The man at the stall barely looked at it before handing him 3 coins. Too ordinary, he muttered. But ordinary, to him, was the only proof he had ever lived outside the smoke. He thought about not going. Thought about letting the craving pass. About walking past the den and disappearing into some alley where the city could forget him without needing to watch. But then the shaking started again. The kind that begins in your fingertips and works its way up your spine, until your whole body feels like a cry you can't voice. 10 silver coins. He turned them in his hand, one by one, like tiny prayers. The den hadn't changed. It never did. Same cracked floorboards. Same attendant who no longer made eye contact. Same thin blanket on the mat. Now more whole than cloth. He lay down slowly. Every joint protested. The pipe came to him like an old friend returning from war familiar. Wounded. Cruel. The opium was bitter today. Less fragrant. More like rust. It burned differently in his throat. And for a moment, he thought he might vomit. But he didn't. Because this was what the last time meant. Not euphoria. Not ecstasy. Just silence. He didn't smoke for pleasure anymore. He smoked because his body no longer remembered how not to. Because the moment between breaths had grown too wide to bear. Because the ache in his bones wasn't pain anymore, it was absence. The smoke wrapped around him slowly. No rush. No flood. Just a thin veil that softened the corners of the world. The noises outside the den, the carts. The shouting. The dogs blurred until they were just echoes of a life that no longer asked for him. His thoughts slowed. Time no longer passed in minutes or hours, but in exhales. He thought of the river once, how it used to look at dawn, of music drifting from a window he couldn't afford, of someone calling his name and meaning it. No one would call now. There was nothing poetic in it. No epiphany, just breath. And then another. Each one paid for in silver. Each one bought at the price of everything else. He lost count of the exhales. The pipe sat beside him. Cold now? An artifact more than a tool. The smoke no longer danced in the air. It clung low, near the ground, as though reluctant to rise without him. His fingers were curled inward, not by intention, but by the slow collapse of muscle over time. His eyes were half-lidded, not closed, not open. Somewhere between, the mat beneath him had taken on his shape thin, curved, slightly off-centre. It smelled of stale breath and something older, something like surrender. A fly buzzed near his ear, but he didn't lift a hand. He hadn't moved in 20 minutes. 10 silver coins. That's all it took. A single sum for silence. A final transaction in a life that had long forgotten how to bargain for anything else. And still, in the lowest corners of his mind, the hunger pulsed. Not for more smoke, but for what the smoke had once promised. Rest. Escape. Forgetting. But this time, there was nothing to escape. Nothing left to forget. Even pain had become abstract, something he remembered experiencing. Like an old song whose lyrics he no longer understood. He could still hear footsteps outside. The city kept walking. It always did. But no one would pause here. Not for him. Not anymore. His name wasn't spoken. Hadn't been in weeks. He didn't fear dying. What he feared was dissolving piece by piece, until even his shadow forgot the shape it once held. He didn't cry. That, too, had been taken. Only breath remained, and even that was growing shallow. Somewhere, beyond the walls, a child laughed. Brief. High. Unknowing. It cut through the smoke like a thread of wind. For a moment, he wanted to smile. Not from joy, but from recognition. He remembered laughter. Not his own. Someone else's. A boy's. Maybe long ago, before the fog. Then the sound faded, and the silence returned. This was how it ends, not with drama, but with the world quietly looking the other way. Not with a scream, but a whisper swallowed whole. Just one last breath. Held too long, then gone. The Empire profits when you cough. He coughed again. Sharp, wet, and loud enough to wake the cat dozing near the stove. No one turned to look. The sound was too common. The den had become a choir of illness, each throat its own instrument of decay. But the cough wasn't just a symptom. It was a signal. A tiny explosion that echoed far beyond his chest. Because somewhere miles, even continents away, a man was getting paid every time that sound escaped a lung. The Empire, after all, had perfected the business of breath. It began with a flower. Poppy fields in Bengal bloomed not with beauty, but with intent. Under the brutal heat of colonial labour, thousands worked soil that would never feed them, harvesting latex that wouldn't soothe them. Opium wasn't just grown, it was engineered. Dried. Processed. Packed. Crates marked with careful ink. Not for India. Not for Britain. For China. They called it trade. They called it diplomacy. But it was war disguised as commerce. And it spread like mould through silk. Invisible. Invasive. And deadly. He hadn't known, when he took his first hit, that he was part of a ledger, that his lungs were lines in a colonial profit sheet, that every gram he consumed paid for another British estate, another tea shipment, another soldier's wage. But now, he understood. The Empire didn't just sell opium, it sold dreams. Dreams that floated in smoke, slipped into veins, settled into minds until even death seemed like a fair price for silence. He read once in a torn pamphlet handed out by a missionary that 70 Zuru chests of opium had been imported into China in a single year, each chest heavy with pressed bricks, each brick capable of ruining a dozen lives. The math wasn't just staggering, it was strategic, because no empire survives without hunger, and the British Empire learned early that opium created hunger better than any famine could. Hunger for stillness, hunger for numbness, hunger for more. He remembered hearing someone joke in the den. The Queen drinks our blood with her tea. Everyone had laughed, but no one denied it. He coughed again, and in his ears, it echoed not like pain, but like currency. Someone, somewhere, had profited from that cough, from that weakness, from that failure, and it wasn't over. Because empires don't just conquer land, they conquer desire. They insert themselves into longing until even your escape routes are toll roads they control. He had thought his addiction was personal. Now he saw it wasn't. It was political. It was historical. It was engineered. Crates of dreams. He whispered to no one. Trail of corpses. He was both, and he wasn't alone. In this alley. In this city. In this century he was just one of millions. An echo in the Empire's long, profitable cough. He'd never seen a map of the Empire. Not a real one. But he imagined it now lines drawn not in ink, but in ash, routes marked by crates, not coordinates. London to Calcutta, Calcutta to Canton, Canton to a narrow street in Shanghai, and finally to his lungs, each point connected by silver, not the shimmering kind sung about in poems, but tarnished coins, handed over by the desperate and collected by the powerful. Even the pipe had a lineage, carved from sandalwood, polished by use, passed down or stolen or bought in the same networks that moved people. Poppies. And power. He wondered if the man who made it had known what it would become, whether it had started as a tool or a weapon. The Empire didn't build walls, it built dependencies, and he was proof they'd succeeded. He coughed again. This time blood followed. Not a stream, but a bead, bright against the dull grain of the floor. A single living punctuation. The boy near the door glanced at him, then away. There was no alarm, only recognition. as if he'd seen this before. And he had, because the cough meant many things. It meant the drug was working too well, too long. It meant the lungs had begun to collapse. It meant the body was no longer a mystery, only a ledger being finalised. And it meant someone had to sweep the mat soon. But it also meant profit. Another purchase. Another payment. Another flicker in a British bank ledger. He laughed. Just once. A dry sound. Not joy. Not despair. Just irony. He had bought his own collapse. And someone else had written the receipt. Behind the curtain, police. Gangs. And smoke. He thought he was trapped in the haze of addiction. But he didn't realise the fog extended far beyond his lungs. It reached into the city's bones. Shanghai's opium dens weren't hidden by design. They were protected by a web of complicity woven by people in uniforms just as much as those in shadows. In the dim light of the alley, officers in crisp caps would stroll past. Their boots clacked on stone, not stomping out crime but ensuring it moved smoothly. Some guards wore quiet pride, flicking their carbide lamps into a den's door to suggest inspection, but they never entered. The curtain wasn't an obstruction, it was a signal, a sign that the system worked precisely as intended. He learned quickly who ruled here. Not just the men with guns or badges, but the ones who negotiated kickbacks. Among them, Huang Jinrong stood tallest a giant in the city's underworld, policed by no one. Officially, he was inspector, a man of law. Unofficially, he was the Empire's overlooked enforcer, ensuring the trade thrived. Dens paid him protection, he paid nothing in return. With wealth and violence cloaked behind his polite smile, he maintained order by keeping the smoke alive. Once, he saw Huang step from a sedan, hands folded behind his back, surveying his territory. No uniform that day, just a tailored suit and a narrow cigarette. A bureaucrat's poise. He waved at the den's proprietor. The man bowed and continued lighting pipes. That simple gesture said everything. Law and crime were two sides of the same coin, and the coin was always flipped for profit. There were brawls in the streets carefully staged for tourists. Younger gangs fought older ones, chasing turf or debt. But elders' men in silk-lined robes watched from open windows. They ran small gangs themselves, handling enforcement, delivering bodies, and collecting a cut from every transaction. Their whispers ensured the city's pulse stayed steady. He remembered a night when a well-dressed enforcer stepped into his den and cracked the head of a man who had tried to steal a pipe. Silence followed. No bystanders moved. The dealer stopped counting his coins. Huang's eyes, dim behind the glimmer of streetlight, didn't flinch. But the message was clear. Law wasn't justice here. Order was. And in that order, he found himself not a criminal, not a victim, but a cog. If he stole a few coins or missed a payment, the police would beat him. If he paid late, a gang would warn him. If he didn't pay at all, they'd bury him quietly, no van, no ceremony, just a hole somewhere behind Amoy Road. He once tried to escape. Dressed in borrowed clothes, he slipped past a patrol, heading north. He reached the Bund before dawn, the river cold and anonymous. He told himself he would leave find work, rebuild somewhere clean, but then he saw the river's edge lined with boarded warehouses, silk crates, tea leaves, opium, all waiting to be loaded back into Empire's chest. He walked away. He walked back into the alley, because the tentacles weren't just physical, they were mental, financial, spiritual. He owed every breath to them, and they owed nothing. Huang died years later in bed, reputedly from a stroke. No funeral followed, but his money stayed. His structures stayed. The dens he protected continued. The gangs he regulated continued. Even his tomb, tucked behind a service lane, was unmarked to passers-by. The Empire's machinery didn't depend on him personally. He was replaceable, but the system he kept alive remained. In the end, he saw himself not as powerless, but as a lesson. Addiction wasn't only about craving opium. It was about craving escape, until you realised that the bars of your cage were gilded by deals, protection, and silent witnesses. He coughed once more, louder than before, and maybe someone, somewhere, collected profit. Even the walls whispered betrayal. The den's owner, once a silent figure behind the curtain, had grown bold. He spoke casually now of police schedules, of protection fees, of who to bribe and when. He didn't hide his profits. Why would he? They were sanctioned. The officer who collected his dues each Friday came not in secret, but through the front door. There was no longer a distinction between law and crime, only hierarchy. Even the smallest runners, the boys who fetched water, swept mats, burned used pipes, knew the system. They learned early that survival didn't depend on right or wrong, but on whom you paid and how fast you bowed. Some dreamed of promotion, of becoming enforcers themselves. They watched the men in dark jackets with envy, not fear. Once, a runner disappeared. Too slow to deliver, too eager to pocket a coin. They found him days later in the canal, floating face down among tea leaves and paper charms. No investigation followed. The officers walked past without pause. He remembered looking at that body. Small, unremarkable, but something inside him cracked. Because it wasn't the death that shocked him, it was the predictability of it. He began to see the system not as corrupt, but complete. It needed all its parts. The addicted, the seller, the enforcer, the silent police. Remove one, and it would rebuild, like fungus, like smoke. It didn't care who fed it, only that it kept feeding. Even language had changed. Protection no longer meant safety. It meant compliance. Justice was a laughable word used only by missionaries and naive newcomers. Among the addicts, the only justice was dosage. One evening, during a rare lucid moment, he asked the den's owner, "Do you ever feel guilty?" The man chuckled. "Feelings don't pay rent." The words stayed with him longer than the pipe did, because guilt had long since left this place. Only smoke remained, shadows in the cracks. At some point, he stopped being a person. It wasn't sudden. No great collapse. No scream. He simply faded. Like wallpaper exposed to too much smoke. Like a word repeated until it sounds foreign. He became something less than visible. Not invisible, just unseen. The city didn't notice. And why would it? Shanghai never paused. The tram still rattled down Weihai Road. The businessmen still haggled at the Bund. The jazz clubs still pulsed their nocturnes for foreigners in tailored coats. Somewhere, a child was born. Somewhere else, someone died. But neither of those somewheres included him. He became a shadow. Not even in the alley's centre, but in its edges. In the cracks. The places people don't clean, don't mention, don't point at when giving directions. He didn't speak much anymore. Words felt too expensive. And to whom would he speak? The other addicts were too far gone. Or too new. Still believing they could bargain with the fog. The den owner only talked when collecting payment. And the police, when they looked at him, saw only a problem deferred. Once, he stood outside a tea shop and watched his own reflection in the window. Not in vanity, in confusion. The glass didn't show a face, just a shape, a slight bend in the light. He tried to wave, as if proving he was still real, but the shape didn't feel familiar, and so he stepped back, into the mist. The city wrapped around him like gauze, soft, but not warm, a comfort that offered no healing. He became the figure people passed by but never registered, the one sleeping near tram tracks, the one coughing behind crates, the one you avoided eye contact with because something in your gut told you he mirrored something buried in yourself. Not failure, but fear. Fear that, given the right grief, the right betrayal, the right slip in fortune, you might end up here too. He became part of the scenery, a moving statue in a city of noise. No one asked his name. No one remembered it. And eventually, neither did he, but he remembered sound. Laughter in a distant courtyard. Bells from a ferry. A mother humming lullabies in Shanghainese so soft it almost hurt. He remembered heat from a stolen cup of tea. The bite of frost against an open sore. A dog's warm breath as it slept near him one night. He remembered enough to ache, but not enough to live. People sometimes left offerings at street corners, bits of bread. Fruit gone soft. Not for him. For luck. For ghosts. But he took them anyway. and in doing so, became the very thing they feared and tried to feed. A ghost. He didn't haunt, he lingered. There's a difference. To haunt is to demand remembrance. To linger is to wait for someone to remember without asking. And no one did. The walls didn't echo his footsteps anymore. The den no longer paused when he entered. The city's heart beat on without skipping for him. But late at night, when the fog grew thick and the streetlights flickered, if you looked carefully at the edge of the frame between the rickshaw and the old wall, you might see him. Not standing, not begging, just there, a shadow in the crack, a breath too soft to count, a name the city forgot to forget, and in that forgetting, sealed him in memory forever. Once, a missionary passed by and knelt near him. She didn't speak Shanghainese well, but her eyes didn't flinch. She held out a roll, half-eaten, and waited. He didn't take it. Not from pride, but because hunger had long stopped being his problem. She whispered something, maybe a prayer, maybe a name, but he no longer knew how to answer either. After she left, he stared at the spot she'd knelt, the imprint her knees left on wet stone. It reminded him that the world still touched itself, that somewhere, even in this fog-bound district, a gesture still meant something. He forgot the words she'd used, but remembered the tone. It hummed in him, long after. At night, he would sometimes trace the city in his mind. Not the whole of Shanghai, but the pockets of it, the secrets only the forgotten know. Where warmth leaks from under a fish vendor's tent. Where the bricks stay sunlit longer in winter. Where rainwater collects but never floods. He had no home, but he knew these places better than any address. He slept curled near a boiler one winter, behind an abandoned tailor's shop. The boiler hissed like a living thing, and he imagined it breathing with him. The warmth wasn't constant, but when it surged, it wrapped around him like a memory of being held. There were nights he felt weightless, not from the smoke, but from absence. No obligations, no schedule, no mirrors, only the city breathing around him, indifferent but consistent, and in that indifference, a kind of peace. But peace is fragile. One dawn, the building was demolished. He woke to steel teeth chewing through brick, and ran limping, coughing, clutching the only thing he still carried, a chipped tin pipe with no flame. That day, he sat by the river, watching fog rise from water instead of lungs. He imagined all the other shadows, the ones lost before him, the ones who might come after, and for a moment, he didn't feel alone, just not yet gone. Not completely, not today, not even the pipe cares. There was a time when the pipe had meaning, not just function. Meaning, it was a ritual then, the press of fingers against wood, the warmth spreading before the smoke, the momentary hush that followed the first inhale. The pipe had been comfort, a bridge between pain and forgetting, a small, hollow sanctuary. But now, it felt like bone, lifeless, cold, uninterested. He held it not with longing, but with obligation, like an heirloom inherited from a stranger, useless yet heavy with memory. He lit it with hands that no longer trembled, not because he was steady, but because even the tremor had grown tired. The flame touched the residue inside and nothing happened. The smoke rose, but no warmth followed. No illusion, no escapee. Just a vague sting in the back of his throat and the stale taste of habit. The pipe had stopped responding, and so had he. There was no comfort left in the fog, no soft edge to the world, just a task performed without hope of reward. Each motion mechanical. He filled the bowl, not expecting relief. He drew breath, not expecting stillness. It was a conversation that no longer required answers. He stared at the pipe like it might explain itself. But it never had. It was just a thing, a vessel. It had never cared whether he lived or not, never mourned his decline, never once whispered enough. He had built a relationship with an object, and expected it to love him back. The realization stung more than any craving. Because when the thing you depend on stops responding, when even your escape no longer lets you flee, what are you left with? What are you, when even your addiction is indifferent? He sat with the pipe in his lap, unlit now, just there, a presence, like a corpse you refused to bury. He could remember the early days, how he had once cleaned it carefully, how the lacquer had shone in lantern light, how he had even named it, though he couldn't recall the name now. Something poetic, something absurd. Now it was just wood. Cracked, stained, silent. He turned it over in his hand, wondering how many others it had passed through before him, wondering how many lips it had touched, how many stories it had erased. Because that's what the pipe was. In the end, a deletion tool. It didn't soothe. It subtracted. Slowly. Precisely. Elegantly. Until there was almost nothing left. And now, he was at almost. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. Those were luxuries of feeling. He simply stared ahead. Past the curtain. Past the street. Past the notion that there might still be a next. Even the dealer had grown quiet around him. No longer asked if he wanted more. Just nodded. Just refilled. Like they were part of some long, bureaucratic process neither one believed in. He tried to imagine quitting not for health, but for the absurdity of it. What would it mean to quit something that had already quit you? He smiled. A small, broken smile, because that was the punchline. He had built his world around something incapable of loyalty. And now, as it faded, he was left holding nothing but the echo of a crutch. The pipe, once a lifeline, was now a mirror, and what it reflected was void. One night, in the hollow stillness after the last pipe, he rested it beside him like a companion whose conversation had dried up. There was no hostility, just distance. The way old friends drift not because of betrayal, but because silence grows too loud. He watched it sit there on the mat. Once, he would have feared losing it. Now, he wondered what it meant to still carry something you no longer believed in. He remembered a proverb his grandmother used to whisper something about tools of comfort becoming tools of chains. Back then, he didn't understand. Now, it felt etched in his ribs. What is left when your vice stops seducing you? When the illusion crumbles not with fire, but with indifference. Even hunger had lost its sharpness. The craving was still there, buried in routine, but it no longer roared. It just muttered, like wind moving through empty shutters. And the pipe offered no reply, no resistance, no mercy. It lay in the dust beside him like a monument to forgetting both architect and archaeologist of his ruin. A shape worn smooth by repetition, a handle to a door that opened to nowhere. He looked at his fingers, calloused, yellowed, cracked. They had held it 1,000 times, as if the holding itself meant purpose. But now they curled away, almost ashamed, as if to say, we've done this long enough. And maybe they had. All the names they forgot. They were once boys with nicknames, girls with braids tied in red silk, fathers who fixed radios, mothers who stitched buttons with thick, clever fingers, friends who shared sesame buns and cold tea under dusty balconies, lovers who whispered names only they would understand. People, not perfect, but whole, and now none of it mattered, because no one remembered their names. He didn't need a list. He carried them anyway, not on paper, but in shadows, faces half-formed, smiles that surfaced in dreams, only to vanish when he reached for them. Ghosts not haunting him, but waiting to be recalled, waiting to be real again. Sometimes, in the alley behind the old theatre, he would sit and murmur what few names he could recall. Liang? He always wore that frayed coat. Miss. She hummed opera while she cooked. Qiang? Didn't talk much, but always shared his matches. It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't grief. It was resistance. Because forgetting was the real death. The one no ritual could undo. There were no plaques for these people. No incense curled for them in family altars. No mourning rituals. No public laments. Only a silence too wide to name. And in that silence, he became their witness. The city had paved over them, alleys turned to roads. Dens turned to storefronts. But beneath it all, the names pulsed faintly, like veins under stone. He once scratched a name into the back of a wooden bench with a nail he found near the tram line. Just a first name. The wood splintered. But he didn't stop. A small act, invisible to most. But in that carving, he felt rebellion. Because they had lived, even if only he still said so. And in saying their names, even whispered into fog, he carved out space where they could exist again. Not as ghosts, but as people still waiting to be remembered. He once imagined a wall, not of stone, but of smoke, and on it, every name they'd tried to erase appeared faintly visible only in the right light. Only if you stood still long enough to truly look. Some of the names he could no longer match to faces, but that didn't make them less real. It only made their disappearance more complete. He whispered them anyway. Not aloud. Inside. Each name like a pulse against forgetting. He saw their traces everywhere. A patch of floor rubbed smooth where someone once knelt nightly. A teacup long cracked but never discarded. A doorway whose frame still held the scent of sandalwood, though its inhabitant had vanished seasons ago. They were gone, but they weren't absent. He carried them, and that made them stay. For a long time. He believed this burden was grief. Now, he knew it was memory. And memory quiet, cracked, persistent was the only protest left to him. Against an empire that turned lives into margins. Against a city that built over its dead. Against a world that forgets the very breath that once filled it. He could not save them, but he could say their names. And in that, perhaps, he saved something of himself too. A system built on silence. He screamed once, not loudly, just enough to test whether his voice still worked. It did. The sound cracked, dry and low, like something remembered rather than created. No one turned, not even the stray dog sleeping by the trash pile. In Shanghai, silence wasn't absence. It was architecture. The buildings were tall, narrow, pressed close together, perfect for echo. But none came. The fog, the walls, the crowded air all swallowed sound before it reached anyone who might care. You could die here 1,000 ways and never disturb the peace. And that was the point. Silence kept things moving. The rickshaw man didn't ask questions when he saw a limp body being dragged behind a tea shop. The grocer swept around puddles that weren't water. The policeman lit a cigarette and stared at a poster long enough for you to finish bleeding. Noise was disruption. And disruption meant attention, and attention meant danger. So they all stayed quiet. And in that quiet, a system flourished. Not just addiction, control, compliance, indifference. It wasn't that people didn't see. It's that they saw too well and chose to blur the vision. It was safer to not know. Safer to sip tea and talk weather. To step over collapsed figures as if they were fallen leaves. To say some people choose that life, and never ask why they had to choose it in the first place. Even the churches were quiet. Bell towers rusted. Choirs disbanded. The prayers now mumbled rather than sung, as if God himself had grown embarrassed by the noise, and he felt it not as loneliness, but as design. The silence wasn't neglect. It was policy. He thought about how this silence grew, how the British ships didn't just carry opium, but quiet, how every crate unloaded onto the docks came with unspoken instructions. Do not look too closely. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not question what feeds you. And everyone obeyed, even the addicts, especially the addicts. They learned quickly that screams brought fists, not help, so they stopped screaming. Then they stopped speaking. Then they stopped existing, until only silence remained. And it sounded a lot like order. The silence had a texture. It wasn't smooth, it pulsed, like skin stretched too thin over something wounded. You felt it in stairwells, in the hush between footsteps, in the way even music from upper floor brothels played softer when someone coughed too hard. It crept into the language itself. Euphemisms bloomed like mould. He's not well meant dying. She left town meant overdosed. They had an accident meant the body was already buried. He once met a boy no older than 10 who knew exactly how much a corpse weighed by the drag it left in wet alley gravel. The child didn't blink as he told him, just asked if he had any bread. This was a silence taught in schools, inherited through glances, enforced without threat, and it protected no one, only the system. Even the den operators learned to whisper their transactions, silver tucked into sleeves. Doses measured by shadow. If the silence cracked, if someone shouted, demanded, bled too loudly, doors would close. Not open. Help didn't come for noise. Help didn't come. The real horror wasn't the addiction. It was the stillness that grew around it. And in time, that stillness became all he knew. The man who never woke up. There was no drama. No final gasp. No sudden cry for mercy. No reaching hand. No cinematic fall. He simply closed his eyes, the way he had 1,000 times before, on the same mat, with the same cracked pipe, under the same lantern that flickered like a tired eye. And this time, he didn't open them again. No one noticed at first. He looked the same as always still. Thin, angled like a question mark. The boy sweeping the floor stepped over him without pause. The dealer adjusted the lamp. Outside. Rain tapped at the window. It took hours. Then someone tried to wake him, not out of concern, but because his time on the mat was up. There were others waiting. The body was in the way. They shook him gently. Then harder. Nothing. No resistance. No breath. Still warm. But only just. Someone muttered. Gone. No one asked his name. No one said it aloud. Maybe no one knew it anymore. There was no announcement. No one ran for help. The city didn't pause. Outside. A tram passed by, trailing steam like smoke. A woman bargained over fish. Somewhere, a baby cried into the afternoon haze. And in the den, they dragged his body to the back room. The same back room as always. The one behind the beaded curtain. The one that smelled of old incense and rotting wood. Where the others had gone before him. Where the smell of death had already become part of the wallpaper. They didn't burn incense. They didn't light a candle. They just made space. Because someone else needed the mat. And the pipe was still warm. That night, when the boy swept the floor again, he paused for half a second near the empty mat. His eyes flicked down. Then away. He said nothing. But his sweeping slowed. Just briefly. Outside. The fog pressed against the windows like breath. Inside. Silence bloomed. Another name lost. Another breath uncounted. The man who never woke up didn't leave behind a letter. A last word. A relic. Only a shape in dust. Only the absence of weight. And maybe that's the cruelest ending. Not fire. Not violence. Just subtraction. A slow erasure that leaves no smudge. No ripple. Only one less shadow in the cracks. The mat dried quickly. A new figure soon curled into the same shape. Like memory reshaping itself into habit. The lantern above gave off its soft yellow haze. Unchanged. The silence resumed, not broken. Only briefly paused. By morning, no one mentioned the man again. There was no tally board. No registry. No soft voice whispering his story into a journal. Just an empty bowl, a forgotten slipper, a faint indentation on the floor that the next body would flatten again. And in that, he was truly gone. Not just dead. Erased. Not even a cautionary tale. Just an inefficiency corrected. A name replaced with another craving. Outside. Shanghai's fog moved through the streets like memory untethered soft. Directionless. Unresisted. And somewhere in that fog, the man who never woke up returned to the city in the only way it still accepted him. As air. As dust. As silence. What if that was you? Somewhere in the city. Far from the lights and markets and songs. A man coughs in the dark. Just once. Softly. Not violently. Not even enough to wake the rats. Just a sound. Caught between breath and forgetting. No one hears it. Not because they are deaf. Because they are used to silence. Because they've made peace with what should haunt them. But you hear it. Don't you? Even now. With your eyes closed. Tucked beneath the weight of your own blankets. In your own country. Your own year. You hear it not in your ears, but somewhere deeper. A space where empathy and fear touch. That cough. What if it had been yours? What if the city you knew taught you silence before language? What if your escape cost your name? What if comfort came in a bowl you couldn't afford but couldn't refuse? And what if no one ever remembered you well enough to forget? The fog is thick tonight. Sleep comes slow. But before you drift, ask gently, what if that was you?